Hello, my name is Nicholas White, and this is a presentation for the VCU School of Social Work's Policy Skills Library. We're doing a presentation on risk factors for suicide and taking a closer look at specifically access to firearms. So suicide is defined as a death caused by injuring oneself with the intent to die, according to the CDC. In the US, somebody dies by suicide every 11 minutes. Suicide accounts for 54% of all gun deaths, and the suicide rate's been increasing since 2000 by 30%. I'll just touch on some of the other major risk factors. At the individual level, if someone has a previous suicide attempt, if they have depression or other mental illness, substance use disorder, social isolation. At the relationship level, if somebody has a high ACE score, if they've had relationship problems such as domestic violence or a breakup. At the community level, if a community has barriers to healthcare, health treatment, how the community views bullying and to what extent that is tolerated or not affects a community level suicide rate. And then societally, if there's a high stigma against mental illness or getting treatment, then that society is more likely to have a higher suicide rate. And then finally, access to firearms, which we'll go into here. So there's a systematic review done, a large systematic review published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which looked at 70 studies that examined the relationship between restricting access to firearms and suicide. They had studies from multiple states within the US, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, and other countries. In addition to studying the relationship between firearms and suicide, they also examined the effect of different legislation in different regions and the effect that that had on the suicide rate. So this systematic review found that studies reliably demonstrated that greater access to firearms was associated with a higher risk of suicide. One example of this was in 2000 to 2002, the 6 states with the lowest firearm ownership rates had half the suicides as the 15 states with the highest firearm ownership rates, despite the population sizes and non-firearm suicides being about the same. And this trend was replicated in 2008, 2009. And finally, for every instance of a gun being used in self-defense, there were 37 instances of the gun being used for suicide. So it's not uncommon to hear someone say when having this conversation with somebody that if somebody doesn't have a gun, they'll just find some other way to kill themselves. Why should we restrict access to guns, they might say, because they may just find some other method. Well, the truth is that guns are incredibly lethal. And if someone doesn't have a gun, they'll resort to some other, if they try to resort to some other method, then they're less likely to be successful. And if they need to resort to some other method, that's more likely to take more time. And in that time, they're more likely to change their mind. Because the truth is, suicides are not often thought over for long periods of time. This is not something that somebody's mulled over and had to, these are often very impulsive decisions that people are making. So when someone needs to resort to another means besides a gun, turns out they're much more likely to survive. And this has been shown in study after study that if they don't have access to a gun, they're much more likely to live. So some of the legislation that's been evidence-based, this list is not everything, but this is what the studies I've seen think are possible, and they're not only evidence-based and will make a difference, but they're actually possible and realistic to get passed in the US. Because of the Second Amendment in the United States, it's not currently realistic to expect that we'll get rid of all the guns in America, which is why it's not included on this list. So first are what are called red flag laws, which restrict gun access to those deemed at risk of harming themselves or other people. What's called a gun violence restraining order, which allows either a family member or law enforcement to temporarily prevent a person from possessing a gun until a judge deems that they're safe. Requiring permits to purchase guns, waiting periods, which make it so that when somebody wants to buy a gun, they have to wait some number of days. Universal background checks, safe storage laws, and then also firearm education. Sort of general firearm education has been shown to have associated with the lower risk of suicide in communities as well. And that's it. I hope this has been helpful, and thanks a lot.